In a few hours from now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will be face-to-face with Donald Trump after the U.S. leaders' meeting with Vladimir Putin last week produced no clear results. Their meeting will be closely watched, with the EU leaders flanking the Ukrainian leader. Professor David Dunn, Chair of International Politics at the University of Birmingham, joins us live for more analysis on this. Professor Dunn, no ceasefire yet, but some saying that this round of talks with Zelenskyy and his European allies petitioning the White House later could be even more crucial than the Alaska summit. Your expectations?
My expectations are that this is an attempt by the Europeans and the Ukrainians to reframe the discussions, because what Vladimir Putin did was to try successfully to reframe the Ukraine as an irritant to better relations between Russia and the United States. And this is the Europeans' chance to say, no, that's the wrong way of looking at this. This is a problem that needs to be seen as of concern to Europe, and therefore you need to see it in that context. So the Europeans will lobby and lobby hard. It's a good thing that they have an opportunity to do so and not be completely framed out of the conversation.
Well, that's a good point, because it could actually, the lack of a ceasefire deal in Alaska could actually present an opportunity for Europe to rally together, to apply even greater pressure on Russia, perhaps, and also take a bigger role in ensuring a future framework, if any, has teeth.
Well, the Europeans are saying that any conclusion to the Ukrainian crisis automatically involves them, not just in terms of their fears about European security from the threat from Russia, but them being a central part of any peace deal that's done and any implementation forces there on the ground. But the wider issue of the ceasefire is a setback for Europe and for Ukraine, because Donald Trump, having gone to Alaska saying he was demanding a ceasefire, has now walked away from that demand, and that makes the prospect of peace much less likely in the short term, because what we had a week ago was a threat of sanctions unless there was a ceasefire. And now we have no prospect of a ceasefire and a protracted negotiation on Russian terms.
Well, let's talk about what did come out of that meeting. And there was some talk in Alaska of offering Ukraine NATO-like security guarantees, but without the NATO memberships. Your thoughts on that, as some worry it's just too vague and too insufficient for Ukraine to feel safe enough to end the war?
So the problem Ukraine's faced since 2014 is there were two agreements that had the endorsement of the European powers and the United States, Minsk I and Minsk II, that Russia then went on to violate, and then violate substantially with the invasion of Crimea, and then, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So the fear is that any agreement that's reached needs to have more teeth, more substance to it than those two agreements. And the fear is that the Americans are not willing to be as supportive as the Europeans would like on those, either in material terms or in terms of the level of commitment that the Americans give to European security. So there is pressure from the Europeans for the Americans to be very substantive in their commitment. And as good that there has been progress towards that, and that America is now accepting that there is a necessity for American military and security guarantees towards the support for the stability force and towards the security and independence of the Romanian part of Ukraine. But there are still concerns there. And even talk about an Article 5 type guarantee is problematic, because if you actually read Article 5 of the NATO treaty, it's actually fairly vague. It says that the parties pledge to give support as they deem necessary. It's not an automatic security trigger that would bring them in. The US Senate ensured that language was vague.
Is that perhaps why Zelenskyy is calling the US offer of added protection historic in his eyes? And a follow-up to that would be, how much agency does Ukraine really have going into talks with Trump, given its reliance on the US in this way, and even European military economic support?
Well, the Ukrainians are less reliant on the United States than they were 6 months ago, because the Trump administration has offered no new tranches of economic or military aid. They have effectively started to wind down some of the sanctions that they're imposing on Russia, and they give an indication of a desire to move beyond the impediments in relations between Moscow and Washington that the Ukraine crisis has got. So the Europeans have stepped in and filled the breach, so much so that most of the aid, even military aid, going to Ukraine now comes from Europe. And that means that the Europeans are demanding more of a role in the final part of the settlement. But Ukraine is being pressured by Washington to actually cede ground. And the fact that Donald Trump is tweeting about these things, suggesting that Ukraine give up NATO aspirations for membership and give up Crimea, is actually not a good way of doing negotiations when you're pressuring your own side in public through these new media channels, rather than actually doing it from behind closed doors.
Absolutely, quiet diplomacy. Well, you mentioned earlier, Crimea remains that flashpoint. Ukraine insisting it must be returned, while Russia is claiming it's permanently annexed. Now, can any peace deal be reached and held if Crimea's status is not resolved?
Yeah, I mean, most people think that in any settlement, Crimea de facto will not return to Ukraine. The bigger issue now is the Donbass, where the Russians not only are demanding that they hold all the positions that they occupy illegally militarily, but actually they actually want the 30% of Donetsk that they don't occupy. They want the Ukrainians to withdraw from all their defensive positions there. So they actually have increased their demands of a week ago, and it seems as if Mr. Trump is echoing that formula as a way of getting the fighting to stop, and that level of pressure on Ukraine is unacceptable. And I think the European allies will be telling the Americans that in no uncertain terms when they go there today. Mr. Putin seemed to score a diplomatic victory over Mr. Trump in Alaska by getting him to adopt his talking points and actually putting pressure on Ukraine to follow his demands. And it's now the turn of the Europeans to try and reverse that and to get the Americans to accept that actually they should be going back to the position they were in a week ago, rather than the one they've been persuaded to do by Mr. Putin at the weekend.
And as we said earlier, Professor David Dunn, a bit of a roller coaster ride, still a lot more to come. But thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. David Dunn is the chair of international politics at the University of Birmingham.